There is a specific kind of economic deal that trade sanctions cannot reach, that tariff schedules cannot price out, and that executive orders cannot unwind. Not because the deal was structured with legal cleverness designed to evade the specific mechanisms of American trade pressure, but because the deal was structured in a jurisdiction. Between parties, in currencies, through institutions, and under governance frameworks that exist entirely outside the legal and commercial architecture through which American trade policy operates, deals that American trade pressure cannot touch not because they were hidden from it but because they were built beyond its reach in the specific, deliberate, institutionally disciplined way that a government builds things when it has decided that the most important feature of what it is building is that no external party holds the power to dismantle it. Canada signed $55 billion of those deals, not in a single signing ceremony, not in a single location or a single week or a single diplomatic initiative designed to produce a press release and a photograph, in a series of signings distributed across 7 cities on 4 continents over a period of 31 days each. Signing individually significant, each individually the product of months of bilateral commercial and diplomatic engagement, and each individually designed so that its commercial viability did not depend on the state of the Canada-United States bilateral trade relationship or on the American administration's assessment of whether Canadian trade partnerships with non-American nations were consistent with its preferences for how the North American trade architecture should be organized. Donald Trump was briefed on the first signing 12 hours after it occurred. He was briefed on the second signing 24 hours after it occurred. By the third signing, the American Trade Department had established a monitoring protocol that provided real-time notification of Canadian bilateral commercial commitments above a threshold. Value a protocol whose establishment was itself an acknowledgement that Canada was signing deals fast enough that 12-hour and 24-hour notification timelines were insufficient for the American trade apparatus to maintain the situational awareness that the scale and the pace of Canada's commercial activity required. The monitoring protocol did not slow the signings. It did not deter the partners. It did not produce the American diplomatic pressure on Canada's commercial counterparties that its establishment implied was being considered, because the deals that the monitoring protocol was tracking were deals that American diplomatic pressure had no mechanism to contest, structured in jurisdictions, denominated in currencies, governed by institutions, and backed by commercial interests on both sides that existed independently of whatever the American Trade Department's monitoring protocol concluded about their relationship to the bilateral trade confrontation it had been established to manage. $55 billion 31 days, 7 cities, 4 continents, and the details, the specific, operational, commercially verifiable details of what Canada signed, with whom, for what, on whose terms, and through what institutional architecture are the details that the American trade apparatus found most devastating when its analysts assembled them into the unified picture that the real-time monitoring protocol had been providing the data for, but that nobody had assembled into a single coherent assessment until the 31st day when the final signing occurred and the full $55 billion was visible in one accounting. The assessment was delivered to the American Trade Department senior leadership on the morning of day 32. It was 41 pages. Its conclusion was 2 sentences. The conclusion read, Canada has signed $55 billion of commercial commitments in 31 days that are structured entirely outside the mechanisms through which American trade policy operates. There is no available American policy instrument capable of contesting, reversing, or materially reducing the commercial significance of these commitments without actions whose costs to the American economy would substantially exceed any benefit their execution could produce. No available instrument, 2 sentences, 41 pages of evidence, and the specific devastating detail that each of the $55 billion represented was the detail that made those 2 sentences not a policy recommendation but a statement of structural fact. This is the story of the $55 billion, the deals, the details, and why the American trade apparatus used the word devastating in its own internal assessment of what Canada had signed. The first signing was in Tokyo, $7 billion. A comprehensive energy and critical minerals partnership framework between Canada and Japan that extended and deepened the preliminary agreements that Canada's Pacific Coast liquefied natural gas infrastructure had made commercially viable 18 months earlier. The Tokyo signing was not the beginning of the Canada-Japan commercial relationship that the framework represented. It was the formalization of a relationship that had been developing for 14 months, the conversion of preliminary supply agreements, exploratory logistics arrangements, and provisional financial frameworks into the kind of legally binding, institutionally backed, commercially committed partnership whose 30-year contracted terms placed it entirely beyond the reach of any bilateral trade confrontation, whose political life cycle was measured in electoral cycles rather than decades. 30-year contracted terms, $7 billion, denominated in yen and Canadian dollars through settlement mechanisms that process transactions outside dollar-denominated financial infrastructure, governed by a bilateral commercial arbitration framework hosted in Singapore, whose jurisdiction was not subject to American regulatory authority, and backed by the commercial interests of Japanese industrial consumers whose energy security planning had incorporated Canadian supply as a permanent structural element rather than an emergency alternative to their traditional supply relationships. The American Trade Department's analyst who reviewed the Tokyo signing noted three features that distinguished it from a standard bilateral energy supply agreement and that made the assessment of American policy reach over it particularly significant. First, the 30-year contractual term exceeded the planning horizon of any American administration by a factor sufficient to make the administration's preferences regarding the deal's existence irrelevant to its commercial execution. Second, the yen and Canadian dollar denomination removed the dollar settlement leverage that American financial infrastructure held over transactions processed through dollar-denominated systems. Third, the Singapore arbitration jurisdiction placed the deal's commercial enforcement outside American legal reach regardless of what American regulatory actions might be taken in relation to the bilateral trade confrontation. Three features, each one a dimension of structural insulation from American trade policy reach. Together, a commercial instrument that the American trade apparatus's most experienced analysts concluded was specifically designed to be beyond their reach, not in a way that reflected legal adversarialism but in a way that reflected the institutional knowledge of a government that understood exactly which features of commercial architecture determine whether a deal is touchable and had built all three insulating features into the Tokyo signing before the ink was dry. The second signing was in Frankfurt, $9 billion. A critical minerals processing and industrial technology partnership with Germany whose commercial logic reflected the specific complementarity between Canadian resource wealth and German industrial sophistication that the bilateral trade confrontation had accelerated from a long-term strategic opportunity into an immediate commercial priority for both parties. Germany needed lithium. Canada had lithium. Germany had the industrial technology to convert Canadian lithium ore into the battery-grade processed lithium that electric vehicle manufacturing required at commercial scale. Canada had the mining infrastructure to extract Canadian lithium ore at the volumes that German industrial demand required. The Frankfurt framework converted that complementarity into a commercial partnership whose terms gave German manufacturers the supply security their industrial planning required and gave Canadian mining operations the processing technology and the long-term demand commitment their capital investment required. $9 billion, denominated in euros and Canadian dollars, governed by EU commercial law frameworks whose jurisdiction was entirely independent of American regulatory authority, backed by the commercial interests of German manufacturers whose supply chain planning had incorporated Canadian critical mineral supply as a strategic priority independent of their assessments of the Canada-U.S. bilateral trade relationship, and structured with the specific institutional features euro denomination, EU jurisdiction, long-term contracted terms that placed it in the same category of structural insulation from American trade policy reach that the Tokyo signing had established. The Frankfurt signing's commercial significance extended beyond its $9 billion value. It was the signing that established Canada's position in the European critical minerals supply architecture not as a supplier whose participation was contingent on the bilateral political relationship with the United States but as a permanent, institutionally committed component of the European industrial supply chain whose reliability was backed by the legal frameworks of EU commercial law rather than by the diplomatic goodwill of a bilateral relationship whose volatility had been demonstrated with 18 months of evidence. The third signing was in Mumbai, $11 billion. The largest single signing of the 31-day period and the one whose geopolitical implications extended furthest beyond the commercial value the $11 billion represented. India's participation in the Canadian commercial architecture had been the most diplomatically complex of the 11 framework nations to develop not because of commercial incompatibility but because of the specific diplomatic sensitivities of a bilateral relationship between a G7 economy and the world's most populous democracy whose strategic interests did not always align with the Western multilateral frameworks that Canadian diplomacy typically operated within. The Mumbai framework navigated those sensitivities through the specific commercial logic of mutual need that transcends diplomatic complexity when the commercial interests on both sides are sufficiently aligned. India needed Canadian agricultural products wheat, pulses, canola at volumes and at prices that its own agricultural production could not consistently supply to a middle class growing at rates that created food security planning requirements of continental scale. India needed Canadian energy supply liquefied natural gas for industrial consumption and electricity generation at the supply security levels that its infrastructure development trajectory required, and India needed Canadian critical minerals, the lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements that its domestic electric vehicle manufacturing ambitions required at scales that its own domestic production could not provide. Canada needed what India offered in exchange: a market of 1.4 billion consumers for Canadian agricultural exports whose American market access had been disrupted by the bilateral trade confrontation, a manufacturing partnership that gave Canadian industrial development access to Indian engineering capacity and Indian technology, sector sophistication, and a diplomatic alignment with the Global South's most significant economy that gave the multilateral commercial architecture Canada was building a geographic and demographic reach that no combination of Western economies could have provided. $11 billion, denominated in rupees and Canadian dollars through bilateral settlement arrangements that process transactions outside dollar-denominated infrastructure, governed by a bilateral commercial framework whose arbitration mechanism was hosted in Singapore, and backed by the commercial interests of Indian industrial planners whose supply chain development had incorporated Canadian resource supply as a permanent structural element rather than a temporary diplomatic arrangement. The remaining signings Seoul, Riyadh, Sao Paulo, and Sydney added $28 billion to the $55 billion total across the final 20 days of the 31-day period. Each signing addressed a specific dimension of the multilateral commercial architecture that the Tokyo, Frankfurt, and Mumbai signings had established. Seoul extended the South Korean manufacturing supply chain integration framework that the Global Commercial Partnership's founding documents had initiated. Riyadh established the WAY Financial Infrastructure Partnership that gave the multilateral architecture access to the Gulf's sophisticated financial system and its sovereign wealth capital. Sao Paulo converted the competitive agricultural relationship with Brazil into the complementary partnership that both nations' export development strategies required, and Sydney deepened the Australian agricultural and critical minerals complementarity framework whose commercial logic had been obvious since Canada and Australia had found themselves competing for the same market spaces that American agricultural disruption had opened. $28 billion for signings, for cities, for continents, and the specific, commercially grounded, institutionally insulated character that each signing shared with the Tokyo, Frankfurt, and Mumbai frameworks that had preceded it, the character of deals built beyond the reach of the American trade policy instruments that the bilateral confrontation had deployed and that the 41-page assessment had concluded had no available mechanism to contest. Warren Buffett reviewed the 41-page American assessment and offered the observation that has circulated through financial networks with the velocity that accurate observations about structural economic conditions consistently achieve. He said the assessment's conclusion, no available instrument, was the most honest two-word description of a government's strategic position that he had encountered in 70 years of observing governments assess their strategic positions. Governments in difficult strategic positions typically produce assessments that identify available instruments even when those instruments are insufficient, because the identification of available instruments is the institutional mechanism through which governments maintain the internal narrative of strategic agency that bureaucratic cultures require to function. An assessment that says no available instrument is an assessment produced by analysts who have concluded that the institutional narrative of strategic agency is no longer supportable by the available evidence. That conclusion, Buffett said, is the most consequential conclusion an assessment can reach, and Canada's $55 billion had made it the only conclusion the evidence supported. He said one final thing. He said the deals are devastating not because of their dollar value. $55 billion is significant but not unprecedented. The deals are devastating because of their architecture. Because each one was built with the three features that make American trade policy reach structurally impossible non-dollar denomination, non-American jurisdiction, and contracted terms that extend beyond any American administration's political life cycle. Those three features, present in every one of the $55 billion worth of signed frameworks, represent not a legal strategy or a diplomatic gambit but a commercial philosophy. The philosophy that the most durable economic partnerships are the ones built entirely on mutual commercial interest, governed entirely by the institutions of the parties involved, and structured entirely outside the reach of any third party whose political preferences might make the partnership inconvenient. Canada built $55 billion on that philosophy, and the philosophy, once built into $55 billion of signed, legally binding, institutionally backed commercial commitments, is not a position that any press conference, any tariff announcement, or any diplomatic communication can argue with. It is a fact, signed, deposited, operational, and entirely, permanently, beyond reach. The American Trade Department's monitoring protocol continues to operate. It continues to receive real-time notifications of Canadian bilateral commercial commitments above its threshold value, and it continues to produce assessments whose conclusions no available instrument, beyond reach, structurally insulated describe with increasing specificity and increasing finality the commercial reality that $55 billion of signed deals have made permanent. Trump cannot touch the deals. The details are devastating, and the 41-page assessment that his own Trade Department produced on day 32 of the 31-day signing period is the most honest accounting of what those details mean that any party to the bilateral trade confrontation has produced. No available instrument, 2 sentences, the most expensive 2 sentences the American trade apparatus has written in 18 months of confrontation, because they describe not a negotiating challenge that creative diplomacy can address but a structural reality that $55 billion has made permanent beyond reach, beyond revision, beyond the reach of any trade policy instrument that any administration has available to deploy. Canada signed the deals. The details are devastating, and the monitoring protocol watching them is watching something it has already concluded it cannot stop.